They ripped down my grandfather's bridge on a Tuesday morning. No warning, just chainsaws screaming, 60-year-old timber cracking like gunshots, beams splashing into the creek below. I stood in my boots, coffee still steaming, watching it happen. Darlene Fitch, HOA president, arms crossed, didn't even look at me when she said it.
It was an eyesore, Garrett. Nobody's gonna miss it.
They hauled the beams off like thieves. Thought they owned the place. Dead wrong. Here's what Darlene forgot. I own the only road into their neighborhood. Every single one of those 42 families drives across my land to get home. What would you do when a smug HOA destroys your family's heritage and hands you the keys to shut them down completely? Drop it in the comments. Because what I did next was perfectly legal, absolutely devastating, and long overdue. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a bridge. It starts with 47 acres of land in rural Harlan County, Kentucky, and a man named Virgil Crutchfield, my grandfather, who spent 30 years turning a scrub pine hillside into a working homestead. Grandpa Virgil built the farmhouse in 1958. He dug the well by hand. He ran the fence lines himself, post by post, in soil so rocky it would snap a spade. And in 1962, when the seasonal creek that ran through the back of his property started flooding his pasture access every spring, he built a bridge. Nothing fancy, white oak planks, treated timber supports, steel cable stays, but it was solid as a courthouse, and it connected the back 40 acres of grazing land to the main property road. That bridge was the backbone of the whole operation. I'm Garrett Crutchfield. I'm 53 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 22 years designing drainage infrastructure for county governments across 3 states. I know what a load-bearing structure looks like. I know what it can handle. And I know that bridge, which I reinforced in 2009 with galvanized steel crossbeams, was rated for a 12,000-pound load, inspected and documented, and had never once failed. Now, here's where the trouble begins. About 6 years ago, a developer named Consolidated Ridge Partners bought the 40 acres directly south of my property and subdivided it into what became the Ridgecrest Estates development. 42 houses, cookie-cutter colonials, all of them backing up to a private access road that the HOA managed, the Ridgecrest Homeowners Association, a name that, in hindsight, should have come with a warning label. The HOA's president was a woman named Darlene Fitch, mid-50s, bottle blonde, the kind of person who sends certified letters about the height of your mailbox. She'd moved into Ridgecrest Estates 4 years ago from suburban Columbus, Ohio, and had apparently decided that rural Kentucky needed her guidance. Badly. I didn't have much to do with Ridgecrest at first. My land abutted theirs along a 180-foot fence line, but we weren't connected. Different deeds, different roads, different lives. Or so I thought. The first unfair act came in the spring, 2 years after the development opened. My creek, the one Grandpa Virgil's bridge crossed, ran along the edge of the Ridgecrest property. When I applied for a routine county permit to dredge it, Darlene Fitch showed up at the Planning Commission meeting and objected. Said the dredging would alter drainage patterns, affecting Ridgecrest property values. The commission, 2 of whose members I later learned played poker with Darlene's husband, delayed my permit for 14 months. 14 months. To clear silt from a creek my family had managed since before Darlene Fitch's parents were born. I grumbled. I waited. I eventually got my permit and dredged the creek, but I noticed something that spring. The main road into Ridgecrest Estates, the only road, a private lane called Sycamore Ridge Drive, ran along the eastern edge of my property. It was a 10-foot easement, recorded in 1987 as a condition of an older subdivision that had since been absorbed into the Ridgecrest development. The HOA maintained it. Their residents used it every day, and it crossed, at the very bottom of the hill, through a culvert, directly under the corner of my fence line. I filed that detail away. Didn't think much of it yet. Then Darlene Fitch found my bridge. She drove up my access road one afternoon in her white Escalade, the one with the custom HOAStories vanity plate. I am not making that up, and told me, standing right there in my gravel driveway with the smell of cut grass and creek mud thick in the air, that my bridge was a visual nuisance and potential liability that could be seen from 2 houses on the southern edge of her community, and that the Ridgecrest HOA was formally requesting I remove it. I told her the bridge was on my property, predated her neighborhood by 60 years, and she was welcome to take her concerns somewhere it would be appreciated. She smiled, thin and cold, like the edge of a wet envelope. "We'll see about that," she said. She drove away, and I stood there in the gravel with a bad feeling spreading in my chest, watching her taillights disappear through the pine trees. The certified letter arrived 11 days later. It was printed on Ridgecrest HOA letterhead, a logo featuring a little ridge silhouette, and I swear, a tiny crown above it. And it alleged that my bridge constituted a structural encroachment on HOA-adjacent airspace and visual easement corridor. I read that sentence 3 times. Airspace and visual easement corridor. I'd spent 2 decades in civil engineering, and I had never once heard the phrase visual easement corridor used in a legal context, because it is not a real legal term. I called my property attorney, a sharp woman named Cecilia Drummond, who'd handled my grandfather's estate and knew this land's deed history going back to the 1940s. I read the letter to her over the phone. There was a pause. "Garrett," Cecilia said, "that's not a thing." That's what I thought. Ignore it. I ignored it. For about 3 weeks. Then the second letter arrived. This one CC'd to the county zoning board, citing a section of the county's nuisance ordinance that covered structures visible from a public or private roadway that may constitute an eyesore. The HOA was formally requesting a zoning inspection of my bridge. Now, the nuisance ordinance Darlene had dug up was real. It was also written in 1978 to deal with abandoned vehicles and collapsed chicken coops, not functional agricultural bridges. But it gave the county a hook to act, if the zoning officer was sympathetic. And as it turned out, the county zoning officer, a man named Dwight Haas, had a son-in-law who'd recently bought a house in Ridgecrest Estates. Funny how these things work out. Dwight Haas showed up at my property on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead, which is technically allowed for exterior inspections under the county code. I was out on the back 40 when he arrived, but my neighbor Burl Tatham, 68 years old, retired coal company foreman, the kind of man who remembers every vehicle that passes his driveway, watched Haas walk out to the bridge, spend about 4 minutes out there, and write something on his clipboard. The notice arrived that Friday. My bridge had been flagged as a potentially non-compliant structure under County Code 14.7b, and I had 30 days to either apply for a variance or remove it. 30 days. For a 60-year-old bridge on my own land. I felt the heat of genuine anger then, something solid and clarifying, like the crack of cold air when you step outside in January. This wasn't a nuisance complaint. This was a coordinated pressure campaign. I hired Cecilia Drummond full-time on the case and filed for a variance the same day I got the notice. I also formally requested Dwight Haas's inspection notes, his communication logs, and any correspondence between the zoning office and the Ridgecrest HOA under Kentucky's Open Records Act. That's a real law, KRS Chapter 61, and it requires government offices to respond within 5 business days. Takeaway: open records requests cost nothing and can expose a lot. While we waited on the records, I did something else. I called the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Fund, because my bridge crossed a registered low-water crossing over a tributary that fed into a creek designated as a warm water aquatic habitat under state environmental guidelines. I asked them, casually, whether the demolition of a 60-year-old low-water crossing on a state-designated habitat tributary would require an environmental impact review. They said yes, almost certainly. I thanked them and filed that away. The variance hearing was set for 6 weeks out. 2 weeks before the hearing, I got the open records documents back. And there, in the zoning office's email logs, was a message from Darlene Fitch to Dwight Haas, sent the morning before his surprise inspection. It read, "Dwight, I think it's time we move on the Crutchfield situation. Let me know when you've had a look." Signed with her name and the HOA email address. Now I had something. But here's where Darlene made her first serious strategic error. Emboldened apparently by the zoning notice, which she must have assumed would send me scrambling to comply, she did something that crossed a line she absolutely could not walk back across. The night before my variance hearing, her HOA work crew showed up at my property at 6 a.m. with a bobcat loader, a chainsaw, and a flatbed trailer. By the time I heard the engine from my bedroom and got my boots on, They had already taken out the cable stays. By the time I got down the hill, they were loading the last beam. My grandfather's bridge, gone. The crew foreman, a kid named Tyler who clearly did not understand what he had been sent to do, handed me a piece of paper. It was an emergency abatement notice, signed by Darlene Fitch in her capacity as HOA president, citing an imminent structural hazard under the same county nuisance ordinance. Here's the thing about emergency abatement. It is a real legal mechanism, but it requires a finding of actual imminent danger by a licensed structural engineer or a government official. Darlene Fitch is neither. She had signed the notice herself. I took a photo of Tyler's face, confused, a little scared, and another of the paper in my hand. Then I called Cecilia Drummond. "They tore it down," I said. A long pause. "Garrett," she said quietly, "they just made this very, very easy for us." Within 48 hours, Cecilia had filed 3 separate legal actions. First, a civil trespass claim against the Ridgecrest HOA and Darlene Fitch personally, supported by photographs, Burl Tatham's eyewitness account, and the abatement notice bearing Darlene's signature. Second, a complaint to the Kentucky Attorney General's office alleging misuse of the county nuisance ordinance in coordination with a private HOA, specifically citing the email I'd obtained through the open records request. Third, a complaint to the Kentucky Board of Registration for Professional Engineers, because the emergency abatement notice had referenced a structural hazard determination that, legally, can only be made by a licensed PE. Since no licensed PE had signed it, someone had made an unauthorized engineering determination, in writing, under their name. Darlene Fitch, I would later learn, had not consulted an attorney before any of this. But Darlene was not the type to recognize when she was sinking. She was the type to dig faster. The week after the trespass filing, she sent a mass email to all 42 Ridgecrest homeowners. I got a copy because Burl Tatham's daughter owned a house in the development. The email described me as a hostile neighbor attempting to weaponize the legal system against our community, said I had illegally obstructed county abatement procedures, and, this is the part that really got me, called my bridge a structurally condemned eyesore that posed a flood risk to downstream properties. A structurally condemned eyesore. The bridge Dwight Haas had looked at for 4 minutes. The bridge no licensed engineer had ever assessed. The bridge I had reinforced in 2009 with documentation I still had on file. The smell of her fear was almost sweet, like burnt coffee left on the burner too long. Here's what Darlene didn't know about me, and what she couldn't have known from looking at a rural property in Harlan County. I had spent 22 years writing contracts for county infrastructure. I knew how easements worked. I knew how drainage rights worked. And I had spent the last 2 weeks going over every piece of paper associated with every parcel of land within a quarter mile of my fence line. What I found was this. The access easement for Sycamore Ridge Drive, the road into Ridgecrest Estates, the only road in or out, had been recorded in 1987 as a temporary ingress-egress easement granted by the original landowner of that parcel, a man named Horace Blankenship, to a development company that no longer existed. When Consolidated Ridge Partners purchased the land and developed Ridgecrest Estates, their title company had noted the easement in the deed but had not, critically, updated or re-recorded it under the new development's ownership structure. The easement was a legal artifact attached to a corporation that had been dissolved in 2003. More importantly, the easement ran across what was now my fence line, specifically the southeast corner of my property, through a culvert that I owned and maintained. The culvert was on my land. The road above it was on my land. The 42 families of Ridgecrest Estates used a road every single day that crossed my property on the basis of an easement that was, at best, legally ambiguous. I brought this to Cecilia. She was quiet for a long time. "Do you know what you could do with this?" she asked. "I have some ideas." "You could close that road." "Yes," I said. "I could." I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person by nature. My grandfather was not a vindictive person. We Crutchfields are patient people. We keep our word. We do our work. We don't look for fights. But when someone tears down something your grandfather built with his own hands, something that stood for 60 years, something that meant your family's history and your land's future, you do not simply ask for a refund. You use every tool available to you, legally, methodically, completely. Meanwhile, Darlene had apparently retained an attorney, finally, because we received a response to our trespass filing that argued the bridge had been reasonably abated under emergency public safety provisions, and that any damages were nominal and speculative. Her attorney also submitted an affidavit from Dwight Haas, describing the bridge as visibly deteriorated. Dwight, remember, had spent 4 minutes looking at it from a distance, in the morning, through pine trees. I had the 2009 inspection report from a licensed structural engineer. I had the load rating documentation. I had the maintenance records dating back to 1972. Cecilia filed all of it the next day and formally requested that the court order a post-removal structural inspection of the recovered bridge timbers, which, fortunately, the work crew had left on the flatbed of a Ridgecrest maintenance vehicle parked at the county equipment yard. A licensed engineer came out that week. His report was unambiguous. The bridge had been in sound structural condition at the time of its removal. No deterioration beyond normal weathering. No safety hazard. Dwight Haas's affidavit was now demonstrably false. 2 fronts were open. 2 legal pressure points were building. And I hadn't even played my road card yet. I kept mowing my lawn. I waved to Burl Tatham over the fence. I let things develop at their own pace, the way you let a creek rise, quietly, inevitably, and in the direction gravity has always intended. By the time the trespass case had been active for 6 weeks, the Ridgecrest HOA had spent, by my estimate, somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 in legal fees. I know this because one of their homeowners, a retired school teacher named Wallace Pruitt, who had zero interest in HOA politics and considerable interest in his own bank account, had started asking questions at HOA meetings. Wallace had been reading the financials. The HOA's reserve fund, which was supposed to cover maintenance and capital expenses for the community, had dropped from $42,000 to about $22,000 in the past year. A significant chunk of that was legal fees. Another chunk was the cost of the emergency abatement, the crew, the equipment rental, the disposal of the timber. Wallace emailed me through a contact page on my property website. Yes, I have a property website. I set it up years ago to document land use, drainage work, and maintenance logs, because that is exactly the kind of thing that comes in handy when you are being sued by a homeowners association. His email was simple. Mr. Crutchfield, I think some of us here at Ridgecrest have been kept in the dark. Would you be willing to speak with a few homeowners directly? I said yes, with the caveat that I would not discuss active litigation, but I could certainly share documented facts. We met at the Harlan County Public Library on a Thursday evening. Wallace, me, and 4 other homeowners who had quietly reached out. The library smelled like paperback spines and old carpet, a smell that always makes me think of Sunday afternoons when I was a kid. I laid out the documented timeline on the table. The open records emails, the pre-inspection contact between Darlene and Dwight Haas, the licensed engineer's post-removal report, the background on the easement. Nobody said much for a while. Then a man named Douglas Hart, a heavy equipment operator who lived on the south end of Ridgecrest, directly adjacent to my fence line, said quietly, "She did all this without a vote." "As far as I can tell," I said. "Yes." He looked at the table. "The HOA bylaws require a board vote for any expenditure over $2,000. The abatement had cost, by the HOA's own invoice, $6,400. Wallace Pruitt exhaled slowly, like a man who has just realized he has been holding his breath for a year. "She didn't have authorization," he said. "That would appear to be the case," I said. "Here is a legal point worth noting. When an HOA president acts without proper board authorization, the liability for those actions can shift from the association to the individual. Darlene Fitch may have personally assumed liability for the cost and consequences of that abatement. Takeaway: always check your HOA's bylaws before assuming the board has authority to act, and get a copy of those bylaws from your state's HOA registry if the HOA won't provide them. I drove home from the library in the dark, down the county road, past the entrance to Sycamore Ridge Drive. I slowed and looked at the road. The culvert was visible at the base of the hill, a 40-inch corrugated steel pipe, installed sometime in the late 1980s, running under the corner of my property line. My pipe, my land. The headlights of a car turned into Ridgecrest as I sat there. Then another. Evening commuters. People coming home from work, from school pickups, from grocery runs. 42 families, all of them using that road. All of them living on the access that ran across a corner of my grandfather's 47 acres. None of them knew. Meanwhile, Darlene had been busy on social media. She'd posted to the local Facebook group, Harlan County Neighbors and Community, a message warning residents about a dispute with a neighboring property owner attempting to limit community access. She didn't name me directly, but she tagged the Ridgecrest Estates page, which had my address in its location data. The post got 37 reactions and 12 comments, most of them sympathetic to her. I did not respond. I screenshotted it. Because here is something I learned in 22 years of infrastructure work. The loudest person in the room is almost never the person who controls the outcome. The person who controls the outcome is usually the one who owns the pipe. And I owned the pipe. Cecilia called me the following Monday with news. The county attorney's office had quietly opened a review of the communication between Darlene Fitch and Dwight Haas. The email I'd obtained through open records had gotten traction. Dwight had been placed on administrative leave pending review. The zoning board had suspended the nuisance action against my property. One front was closing in our favor. The civil trespass case was building toward a damages hearing, and I had not yet done anything with the road. I scheduled a meeting with Cecilia for Friday. I told her I wanted to talk about easements. She showed up with a title research report, a surveyor's plat, and a thermos of black coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the land records spread between us, and we started building the trap. The title research Cecilia had ordered was 63 pages long. I know that because I read every page. Twice. Here is what it showed. In 1987, the original developer of what would eventually become Ridgecrest Estates recorded an easement for Sycamore Ridge Drive across a parcel then owned by Horace Blankenship. That easement granted ingress and egress rights to the development entity and its successors in title, for the purpose of residential access to Tract 44B. That was the tract that became Ridgecrest. The development entity, a company called Blue Sky Land Partners LLC, was administratively dissolved by the Kentucky Secretary of State in December 2003 for failure to file annual reports. When Consolidated Ridge Partners purchased the land in 2018 and developed Ridgecrest Estates, their title search had flagged the easement. Their attorney had noted it in the title commitment, but here is where the error occurred. They had assumed, incorrectly, that the easement automatically transferred with the land to any successor in title. Kentucky property law does not work that way. An easement appurtenant, one attached to a specific property, transfers with the land automatically. But an easement in gross, one granted specifically to a named entity for its own use, does not transfer automatically. It terminates when the entity dissolves, unless the easement document specifically provides for transfer to successors. The 1987 easement document granted rights to Blue Sky Land Partners, LLC. It contained no successor clause. It granted rights to a named entity that no longer legally existed. When Blue Sky dissolved in 2003, the easement dissolved with it. Takeaway: easement rights in gross die with the entity they're granted to, unless the easement explicitly allows assignment to successors. Always run a full chain of title review on access easements before closing on rural property. I sat back in my chair and listened to the house settle around me. The old farmhouse makes sounds in the evening, the tin roof contracting, the floorboards adjusting. Sounds I've heard since I was a boy. My grandfather used to say the house was just getting comfortable. I think he was right. So what they have, I said slowly, is a road across my land with no valid easement. Correct, said Cecilia. Which means they have been using my property for 6 years without legal right. Trespass, she said. Ongoing, continuous trespass by 42 homeowners and their guests. There was a specific number Cecilia then mentioned that I want you to sit with. In Kentucky, ongoing trespass damages can be calculated per day, per incident. For a road used by dozens of vehicles, over 6 years, the theoretical damages were substantial. She wasn't recommending we pursue all of it. That would be aggressive beyond what we needed. But the existence of the claim was a weapon. I don't want to destroy those families, I said. They didn't do anything wrong. Most of them probably don't even know who owns the culvert. "I know," said Cecilia, "but Darlene knows who to call when she needs a bulldozer. Let's make sure she also knows who she needs to negotiate with." We decided not to file anything yet. We decided to wait for the right moment, the moment when Darlene was most exposed, most financially stressed, and most publicly visible, the moment when a single, well-timed legal move would hit hardest. I put the title report in the fireproof safe next to my grandfather's land deed, his 1962 bridge construction plans, and the certified mail receipt from Darlene Fitch's first letter. Then I went out and drove a fresh fence post at the southeast corner of my property, right next to the culvert, just to mark the spot, just so I'd know exactly where things stood. The next 6 weeks were the most productive of my life. I am a methodical person by training and by nature. I make lists. I work backwards from outcomes. I verify. And what I was building during those 6 weeks was not just a legal case. It was an architecture, a structure designed to hold weight from every direction, so that when the load finally came, nothing could shift. Let me walk you through it, because some of these moves are things anyone can do, and they are worth knowing. First, the physical survey. I hired a licensed land surveyor, a meticulous man named Harmon Peck, who had surveyed this county for 30 years, to conduct a full boundary survey of my southeast corner and produce a stamped plat showing the exact location of the culvert, the easement corridor, and the boundary line. The survey cost $1,200 and took 4 days. The resulting plat was a legal document, admissible in court, showing precisely that the road and culvert were on my land, with no recorded valid easement. The survey also revealed something I hadn't expected: a 6-inch encroachment. The west retaining wall of Sycamore Ridge Drive extended 6 inches over my property line. 6 inches of concrete, sitting on Crutchfield land for 6 years. Harmon measured it 3 times, 6 inches. I did not mention this to anyone. I just added it to the file. Second, the environmental documentation. I contacted the Kentucky Division of Water and formally documented the creek crossing situation, the creek that my bridge had spanned, which was a state-designated warm water habitat tributary. I provided them with photographs showing the condition of the crossing before the HOA's abatement, and asked them to determine whether the unauthorized demolition of a low-water crossing structure had affected the habitat corridor. Within 2 weeks, they had opened an inquiry. The HOA had not notified the Division of Water before demolishing a structure over a regulated waterway. This is required under Kentucky's Clean Water Act implementation statutes. Takeaway: any construction or demolition near a stream, wetland, or regulated waterway likely requires a state permit. Skipping it is a violation that can result in substantial fines. Third, rallying allies. Quietly. This is important. I wasn't building a mob. I was building a coalition of people with legitimate standing to speak and act. Wallace Pruitt had by now spoken privately to 14 of the 42 Ridgecrest homeowners. Several of them were quietly furious about the HOA's legal spending, the lack of board authorization, and Darlene's management style. Wallace had also discovered, by reading the HOA's own meeting minutes, which are public under Kentucky HOA law, that Darlene had signed 3 contracts in the past year without a board vote: the abatement contract, a landscaping contract, and a contract for HOA legal representation. All 3 exceeded the $2,000 authorization threshold. Wallace filed a formal written challenge to Darlene's authority with the full HOA board, citing the bylaw violations. 4 of the 5 board members, people who had largely been rubber stamps for Darlene's agenda, suddenly realized they might have personal liability exposure if she'd been acting without authorization. 3 of them requested a special board meeting. The 4th, a man named Clint Metter, told Wallace to mind his own business. Clint was Darlene's brother-in-law. I noted that and moved on. Douglas Hart, my fence line neighbor and the heavy equipment operator, had been quietly making inquiries of his own. He'd spoken to the county road engineer, not Dwight Haas, who was on leave, but the actual county engineer, and learned that the Sycamore Ridge Drive entrance off the county road had never been formally permitted as a private road access. There was supposed to be an approved driveway permit on file. There wasn't. Another thread. Another violation. Meanwhile, Cecilia drafted a document I will call the Notice of Intent to Assert Easement Rights. This was a formal legal notice informing the Ridgecrest HOA that we had determined the 1987 easement to be legally void, that the road and culvert were on my property, and that I was willing to negotiate a formal easement agreement, at fair market value, to allow continued access. The notice included a 45-day deadline for response and a specific demand: a full accounting of HOA expenditures related to the abatement of my bridge, an apology for the unauthorized action, and a baseline settlement on the trespass claim. Cecilia also included, quietly, a single attached document, a copy of the surveyor's plat, with the culvert location circled in red. We chose the timing carefully. The HOA had a scheduled annual meeting in 41 days, a public meeting, required by their bylaws, to which all homeowners were invited, and at which the board was required to present its financial report. We wanted to serve the notice 4 days before that meeting. That way, Darlene Fitch would walk into her own annual meeting knowing exactly what was sitting under her road, and so would everyone else. I ordered replacement timber for the bridge, white oak, same species my grandfather had used. I had the lumber delivered and stacked in my barn, where I could see it every morning when I fed the horses. It smelled like fresh sawdust and something older underneath. It smelled like the right thing to do. We served the notice of intent 4 days before the annual meeting, exactly as planned. Cecilia sent it by certified mail to the HOA's registered address and by email to all 5 board members. Then she sent a copy to the homeowner distribution list that Wallace Pruitt had quietly compiled. Every Ridgecrest homeowner with a verifiable email address. 38 of 42. The effect was immediate. Darlene Fitch called my cell phone 20 minutes after the emails went out. I let it go to voicemail. She called again, and again. The 4th time I answered. Garrett. Her voice was carefully controlled, the way a person sounds when they are furious but have decided to perform calm. I think we need to have a direct conversation about this notice. Sure, I said. Have your attorney contact mine. I think we can resolve this between neighbors. Darlene, I said, we stopped being neighbors when your crew showed up at 6 in the morning with a chainsaw. Silence. Long enough that I could hear the ambient sound of her SUV, the hum of the engine, the faint tick of a turn signal. What do you want? She asked. Read the notice, I said, and hung up. Now, this is where Darlene made her second serious strategic error. Instead of engaging through legal counsel, which was the only move that made any sense, she went to the offensive. She contacted the Harlan County Courier, the local newspaper, and told them that a neighboring property owner was attempting to hold the entire Ridgecrest community hostage by threatening to close their road. She gave them quotes. She gave them her name. She named me. The Courier ran the story. This was, from Darlene's perspective, probably meant to generate community sympathy and public pressure against me. What it actually did was alert a reporter named Georgia Sims, who covered local government and property disputes, to the existence of a story that was considerably more interesting than the version Darlene had pitched. Georgia called Cecilia, who directed her to me. I gave her the documented timeline, the open records emails, the engineer's report, the easement research, the bylaw violations. I gave her the stamped surveyor's plat. I gave her the Kentucky Division of Water inquiry notification. Georgia is good at her job. She called the county attorney's office and confirmed the ongoing review of Dwight Haas. She called the Division of Water and confirmed the inquiry. She called the state licensing board and confirmed that a complaint had been filed regarding the unauthorized structural determination. She also called Darlene Fitch, who declined to comment. The follow-up article ran 3 days before the annual HOA meeting. The headline was measured. Property dispute raises questions about HOA authority and road access in Ridgecrest Estates. But the content was devastating. Georgia laid out the full picture: the pre-coordinated inspection, the unauthorized abatement, the engineering report, and the easement question. She quoted the surveyor's plat. She quoted the open records email. I keep a copy of that article in the fireproof safe now, next to the bridge plans. In the days between the article and the meeting, Darlene attempted 3 counter-moves. First, she retained a second attorney, a more aggressive firm from Lexington, who filed a motion to dismiss our trespass claim on procedural grounds. Cecilia responded within 24 hours. The motion was thin and went nowhere. Second, Darlene approached 2 homeowners who were sympathetic to her and asked them to speak at the annual meeting on her behalf. One of them, after thinking about it, called Wallace Pruitt instead. The other showed up, but didn't say anything consequential. Third, and this is the one that really illustrated how badly she was panicking, Darlene called Douglas Hart and offered to have the HOA pay for some landscaping work on his property if he stayed out of the meeting. Douglas Hart is not a man who can be landscaped out of his principles. He told me about it the next day. I had him write it down and sign it. Attempted bribery. In writing, effectively, in a phone call he'd taken notes on. I called Cecilia. "Add it to the file," she said. The night before the annual meeting, I sat on my porch and watched the lights of Ridgecrest Estates blinking on, one by one, as families settled in for the evening. 42 houses, 80-some adults, maybe 130, 140 people counting kids. None of this was their fault. They'd bought their homes in good faith. They'd trusted their HOA to manage their community properly. What they hadn't known, what most of them still didn't fully understand, was that the road home ran across a dead easement, a void legal instrument, a ghost written on paper in 1987 by a company that had been dissolved for 20 years. And I held the only key to making that right. Tomorrow, I intended to use it. The annual meeting was held in the Ridgecrest Estates Community Clubhouse, a beige, single-story building with vinyl siding and a parking lot that smelled of fresh asphalt, the kind of structure that says community amenity, but feels like a DMV office. 41 of 42 homeowners showed up. Word had gotten around. I was not on the agenda. I was not officially invited. But Cecilia had determined that, because the road easement matter directly affected my property, I had standing to attend as an interested party under Kentucky's HOA transparency statutes. She came with me, along with Harmon Peck, the surveyor, who brought a rolled copy of his stamped plat. We arrived early and sat quietly in the back row. Darlene Fitch walked in 8 minutes late, flanked by her new attorney from Lexington, a man in a suit that was too heavy for the season, and her brother-in-law, Clint Meter. She looked at me when she came through the door. I gave her a small nod. Her jaw tightened like a machine she was trying to hold together with willpower alone. The meeting opened with the financial report. The HOA treasurer, a soft-spoken accountant named Peggy Talbot, who had clearly been dreading this moment for weeks, presented the numbers. The reserve fund was down to $18,000. Legal fees for the past year totaled $26,400. There was a line item for emergency property abatement of $6,400. Wallace Pruitt asked for the floor. The meeting chair, nervous, looking back and forth between Wallace and Darlene, gave it to him. "Can the board please clarify," Wallace said, "which board vote authorized the emergency abatement expenditure of $6,400? Silence. "The bylaws require a board vote for expenditures over $2,000, Wallace continued, his voice patient and even, like a teacher who has done this before. "I have reviewed the meeting minutes for the past 18 months. I see no vote authorizing this expenditure." Darlene leaned forward. "Emergency actions don't require a vote under what provision?" Wallace asked. Another silence. Darlene looked at her attorney. He leaned over and said something in her ear. She straightened. "We will provide a full accounting," she said, "in writing, within 30 days. "I'd like to move," said a woman in the third row. I later learned her name was Frances Overton, a retired nurse who had been quietly communicating with Wallace for weeks, that the board table all discretionary expenditures pending an independent financial review. It was seconded immediately by Douglas Hart. The vote was 29-7 in favor. Darlene's face went through several emotions in quick succession, none of them pleasant. Then Cecilia stood up. She introduced herself calmly. She explained, in plain language, the easement research and its conclusions. She did not dramatize. She used the language of real estate law, translated into plain English. The 1987 easement had been granted to a named entity that was dissolved, contained no successor clause, and had lapsed under Kentucky law. The road into Ridgecrest Estates crossed my property on a void legal instrument. She then invited Harmon Peck to unroll the surveyor's plat, which he spread across the folding table at the front of the room. You could have heard the asphalt cooling outside. "This is not intended as a threat to this community," Cecilia said clearly. "My client has no interest in harming the residents of Ridgecrest Estates. What he is offering is this: a formal, properly recorded easement agreement at fair market value, which will permanently secure your road access in a legally defensible way. This is the resolution every homeowner in this room actually needs. The question is whether the current board leadership is capable of delivering it. She sat down. Darlene Fitch stood up. Her voice, for the first time, had a tremor in it. Not quite fear, but the precursor to it. The note you hear in a structure just before the load exceeds the limit. This is a negotiating tactic. Darlene, Douglas Hart's voice was quiet, but absolute. Sit down. And she did, because 29 homeowners had just voted against her in her own meeting room, and the newspaper article was sitting in everyone's pocket, and the man whose grandfather built the bridge was in the back row with a surveyor and a property attorney and a fireproof safe full of documentation. Francis Overton moved to form an ad hoc homeowner committee to negotiate directly with my attorney regarding the easement. Passed, 31-6. Darlene Fitch voted no. Her brother-in-law voted no. The 4 others were people she'd appointed to committee positions. After the meeting, in the parking lot, the air was cold and smelled like car exhaust and pine. Wallace Pruitt walked over to me and shook my hand. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry about your bridge, Garrett." "Thank you, Wallace. I think we can fix this." "I know we can," I said. The 30 days after that meeting were busy in a different way than the months before. Before, everything had been underground. Legal filings, surveyor visits, quiet library meetings. Now things were moving in daylight. The ad hoc homeowner committee, led by Wallace Pruitt, Douglas Hart, and Francis Overton, retained their own attorney, separate from the HOA's counsel, to represent the homeowners' interests in the easement negotiation. This is a thing people don't know HOA homeowners can do. When a board's actions create a conflict of interest with the homeowners they represent, individual homeowners can petition for independent representation. Cecilia had anticipated this and actually provided Wallace with the relevant statute. Takeaway: HOA homeowners have more legal rights than most of them know. Check your state's HOA statutes. They are publicly available and often quite protective of individual owners. The negotiation took 12 days. My demands were straightforward. A properly recorded easement in perpetuity, granting access rights to the Ridgecrest homeowners along the Sycamore Ridge Drive corridor. An easement fee of $22,000, payable to me, reflecting fair market value for a permanent easement across my land. Replacement of my bridge at the HOA's cost, using materials and specifications I approved. Full settlement of the trespass claim at $14,000. And a public written apology from Darlene Fitch, issued to the Ridgecrest community and to the Harlan County Courier. The committee accepted within a week. The HOA's Lexington attorney tried to negotiate the bridge replacement out of the package. The committee overruled him. Darlene Fitch resigned from the HOA presidency on a Thursday afternoon. She sent a brief email to the board saying she was stepping back for personal reasons. Wallace forwarded it to me. I read it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn where the white oak timber was still stacked and waiting. But the story didn't end there, because Dwight Haas was not the only domino that was still falling. The county attorney's office completed their review of the open records emails and concluded that there had been an improper coordination between Darlene Fitch and a county employee to initiate enforcement action against my property. Dwight Haas resigned before he could be terminated. The county settled a separate claim, a relatively modest one brought on Cecilia's advice, related to the improper zoning notice for $8,000. The Kentucky Division of Water assessed the Ridgecrest HOA a fine for demolishing a structure over a regulated waterway without a permit. The fine was $11,000. The state licensing board reviewed the complaint regarding the unauthorized structural determination and sent a formal warning letter to Darlene Fitch. She had signed the abatement notice in a quasi-official capacity, advising her that further instances of misrepresenting structural assessments could constitute unlicensed professional practice under Kentucky law. Now, the moment I want to paint for you, the moment that people in this county still talk about. Georgia Sims at the Harlan County Courier had been following the whole arc. She asked me if she could be present when the first beam of the new bridge went in. I said yes. She came out on a Saturday in early October with a photographer, a 22-year-old kid named Miles, who couldn't have been more interested if it was a championship game. And she stood at the edge of the creek bank while Douglas Hart operated the small crane we'd rented, and Burl Tatham's son Donnie guided the first white oak beam into place, and I drove the first bolt myself, with a hand impact wrench, into the galvanized bracket I'd engineered for the new crossing. The bolt went in with a sound like a single, final punctuation mark. Solid, deep, done. Miles took the photo at exactly that moment. Me in my work vest, one knee on the beam, wrench in hand, the creek visible below, the October light doing something golden and specific on the white oak. It ran on the front page of the Courier the following Thursday. Wallace Pruitt drove out and stood at the top of my driveway and watched the last beam go in. He had a thermos of coffee. He didn't say much. He just nodded. At the bottom of the hill, where the culvert ran under the corner of my fence line, where Sycamore Ridge Drive crossed my land, there was now a properly recorded easement, stamped and filed at the Harlan County Clerk's office, granting the residents of Ridgecrest Estates legal, permanent access to their homes. I had not closed the road. I had not evicted 42 families. I had not burned anything down. I had simply waited until the moment when having the power was sufficient, when using it wasn't necessary. The bridge was better than the original. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Grandpa Virgil's bridge was a great bridge, but this one has a galvanized steel frame, pressure-treated white oak decking, and a load rating of 18,000 pounds. I had the documentation laminated and bolted to the western rail, visible from the path. Darlene Fitch passed my property in her Escalade once, about 2 weeks after the bridge went in. I was out by the fence, and I watched her slow down as she went by. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. The HOAPREZ plate was gone. Here's where we land. The settlement totaled $66,000 net in my favor. Easement fee, bridge replacement cost, trespass settlement, and the county claim. Legal fees consumed a significant portion of that, but the bridge was rebuilt. The land was documented. The easements were recorded. Everything my grandfather left me was intact, legally bulletproof, and better documented than it had ever been. More importantly, the 42 families of Ridgecrest Estates now have a properly recorded road easement. Before this, they were living on a legal ghost. They had bought homes and assumed they had road access, but the instrument securing that access was void. If I had sold my property to someone less patient, to a developer, say, or to anyone with a different set of priorities, those 42 families could have found themselves in a very difficult position. What I gave them, through this process, was security. Real, recorded, permanent security. Wallace Pruitt was elected HOA president at the next annual meeting. Francis Overton became treasurer. Douglas Hart joined the board. The HOA's legal spending dropped 92% in the following year. Burl Tatham hosted a cookout at the end of October. He invited most of the county. The bridge was technically the occasion, but mostly it was just a cookout. Ribs and potato salad and coolers of sweet tea, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the creek smell, and the turned earth smell of a Kentucky October. Miles, the photographer from the Courier, came back and took pictures of kids standing on the bridge railing, looking down at the creek. I've got a copy of one of those photos on the wall of my kitchen. Now, here is the part that matters beyond me. The bridge project and the environmental inquiry had surfaced something that Cecilia and I discussed with the Kentucky Division of Water. The creek that runs through my property and through the drainage corridor adjacent to Ridgecrest is a significant warm water habitat corridor for 3 species of native darter fish, a small group of benthic invertebrates that are state listed as species of concern, and a stretch of documented mussel habitat in the lower reach. Nobody had been paying much attention to it. I donated a conservation easement on 112 feet of creek corridor on my property to the Kentucky Land Trust, permanently protecting it from development and requiring its maintenance as a natural buffer. The Division of Water matched it with a small grant for riparian buffer restoration, native plantings along the bank, removal of an old tire pile someone had dumped in the upper reach sometime in the 90s. I also set up a small scholarship fund, the Virgil Crutchfield Memorial Scholarship, through the Harlan County Community Foundation, funded by a portion of the settlement. It awards $500 per year to a Harlan County high school student pursuing a degree in civil engineering, environmental science, or land management. It's not a big number, but it's a real one. And it's named for a man who built a bridge by hand in 1962 because he needed a bridge and knew how to build one. I think you would have liked that. Every few weeks now, Douglas Hart waves to me across the fence line. We've had coffee twice. He's a good man, Most of those Ridgecrest families are good people. They just got sold a development by a company that didn't check its easements, and then got unlucky with their HOA president. None of that was their fault, and all of it is now fixed. One last thing. People ask me, did I enjoy it? Did it feel good when Darlene Fitch's vanity plate disappeared? When Dwight Haas resigned? When the HOA's attorney ran out of angles? Honest answer. It felt like setting down something heavy. Not like winning, like finishing. The bridge is there now. The creek runs under it, the same as it always has. The darters are still in the deep hole below the south bank. The white oak smells like the barn did when my grandfather kept horses there. Play stupid games. Tear down a 60-year-old bridge on a Tuesday morning without checking who owns the pipe. And eventually, the creek finds its level. It always does.